Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Institute. I'm Ken Pollack. I am the Vice President for Policy here at the Middle East Institute, and we're delighted to have all of you here with us in the room, and we're delighted to have all of you who are online tuning into us as well. Our subject for today, of course, is Iran. We want to look at the ongoing protests. We want to talk about the prospects and the options for U.S. intervention. We want to talk about the potential for that to help or hurt the protest movement in Iran. And we also want to talk about the future and what we should be learning from the present experience. I've got a fantastic panel. For those of you who've been to MEI before, at least in the last year, you know that I am not a fan of long introductions. You can look all of these folks up on the internet. They all have extensive bios there. But in little bit of identity politics. To my immediate left, I have Vice Admiral Kevin Donegan. Kidd, as he is known, is the former commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain and the former commander of U.S. Naval Forces Central Command. But even more important that he has now reached the pinnacle of any military career. He is now a distinguished military fellow here at the Middle East Institute. To Kidd's left is Nadereh Chamlou. Nadereh is a former longtime senior advisor to the World Bank, an expert on Iran. And then finally, to Nadereh's left is our own Alex Vatanka, senior fellow here, author of several books on Iran, and our own in-house Iran expert. So we're going to start out. I'll ask the panel a number of different questions. And then at some point, probably about halfway through our session, I'll turn things over to all of you, both here in the room and online, for questions. For those of you in the room, please just raise your hand. We'll have microphones, and we'll bring the microphones to you, and you can ask your question. For those of you online, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. If you're not familiar with it, at the bottom of the screen, right next to the share screen button, there is a Q&A button. You can click on that. It brings up a dialog box. Type your question in there, and my staff will be bringing me questions from all of you, and we'll try to integrate all of it together seamlessly into a brilliant tapestry. All right, with all of those words of introduction aside, let's jump in. Let's start talking. And I want to start with you, Nadereh, and I want to ask you this question. In the US, whenever we see something like this happen, immediately everyone starts comparing it to everything else, right? So this is just like Libya, it's just like Iraq, it's just like, I don't know, Ukraine or Poland. What's different about, how should we think about Iran in that context? Because as you know, as well, if not better than anyone here in this room, Iran is different. What's different about Iran? What's different about these protests? How should we be thinking about this protest movement as uniquely Iranian?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a great pleasure and honor to be here and to be in this panel. You're asking a very quintessential question. Why would the international community be interested in Iran? And what would be, what could we expect? And of course, as you were mentioning, like whenever the issue of, protest regime that comes up, we always compare Iran to the worst case situations. What happened in Libya and what happened, all of the really basket cases of the world. Very few times people compare it to, some positive, outcomes that came out of it. Even in Iraq, I would like to say that Iraq is right now one of the few countries in the Middle East where actually elections happen. I mean, Iran is very often compared to, God forbid, things would happen the way that Iraq would. But, now after many, some decades, democracy is not an easy thing to kind of grow and to implement inside the country. But nonetheless, even Iraq has now a democratic process where people come and go. I'm always reminded of the saying that, the Wright brothers were not the first to fly. They were the first to land. And I think that's a very important thing. It's like the issue is not how regimes come into power or how people come into power. It's how they leave power that is very important. And I think in Iraq, we can say that, governments come, governments go. There is a lot of political power play, but nonetheless, it happens. Now, what makes Iran different is like we have been a cohesive country for several centuries. And I think that when you scratch every Iranian in the sense that a Kurd, a Turk, first of all, we're very much of when people talk about different ethnicities, if I were to use that word, which is these days a very loaded word. But even then, we find that my mother is from this ethnic group, so we are really a melting pot, and it's difficult to say that Iran is are very distinct groups. We are a melting pot. We have a very common, I would say, dominant Persian in the sense that it is around the Persian language, not in the Persian that the Persians are dominating, because none of us are really Persian, because we always have, like in my family, half of us are Azaris and half of us are, So I think that we do have a cohesion in arts, in literature, in everything else that is very unique. And I think that holds us together inside the country as well as outside the country. Now, I think what makes Iran, in addition, different is that we have a very vibrant civil society, even though we don't have the civil society organizations, the NGOs, because every time an NGO becomes slightly even powerful, it's disbanded. But we do have a very active civil society that generates cohesion, that brings people together. So I am quite optimistic that in the future of Iran, we will be able to bring people together. We will be able to really build a new, even today, even in Iran today, you will find a lot of commonality among people from every groupings that you can possibly imagine, from the very conservatives to the very avant-garde. There is a lot that is keeping people together rather than breaking them up. And I think that's a very important element in Iran. We have been fighting for democracy for maybe over a century, more than over a century. And many of us have now lived in democratic countries, have been exposed to democratic issues. And we think, and particularly I used to go for work to Iran quite often, and I'm amazed with the way that the Iranian youth think. It was always very energizing to interact with them. And I think they will force the older generation, my generation, that wasn't very democratic, to really become pluralistic, to become more accepting of differences, but then at the same time finding ways of being cohesive together. I don't know whether I answered your question in a good way, but I think that there are differences. There are positive trends in the Iranian society that one can build on.
So I think you gave a better answer than my question deserved.
Oh,
and for that reason, I'd like to follow up with you on that, because one of the things that we're seeing, and certainly that the government plays up, is the divisions here, right? And the fact that there are some folks who seem to be in support of the regime, obviously others. Help us to understand that, again, in this context of, as you pointed out, there are divisions among Iranians, but there's also underlying unities. How should we see that? I mean, what's your sense of where these divisions lie? I mean, do we have any kind of a sense of just how many support the government? And is this all somehow about the government, or is it about divisions within the society? How do we understand that seeming divide?
Yes, I think if you isolate the ideological groups in the society, the suprastructure, if I were to call it, I think that even among the very conservative people, they want to have an open society. They want to be able to engage with the world. They want to be able to not to be told what to do and also not to tell others what to do. And I think that's very important because they, around 20% are very conservative in the society, roughly because of it. But they don't want to be told also by the more modern groups of what to do and what not to do. And I think we noticed this in the Women, Life, Freedom, and I would like to say that it's only half of the slogans that was it was Women, Life, Freedom, Men, country and development. So that was the second part of the slogan. We only focused on the first part. So in other words, men were also included in that movement. You notice that people from every walk of life were coming to say our personal beliefs are very important. We don't want to be told by others. So I think that again, I don't know whether I'm going in the right direction of answering your question, but I think that is a very important guiding light, I think, for most Iranians that, and again, excluding my generation, because my generation did all of the, brought the ideological baggage that the younger generation has to deal with these days. But I think that more or less, we are facing a different future in Iran than the past. And unfortunately, if we can kind of isolate those who are still in the past or were powerful in the past, I think we can have a very bright future.
That's great. Alex, let me bring you in now. Nadereh gave us a nice start talking about Iran in the context of other protest movements. How about, you've been watching Iran a long time. How has this protest movement looked similar, looked different from what we've seen, yes, with Women Like Freedom, with any number, I count the first real protest movement against this government, first attempt to counter revolution in 1999, right? And we've had another one every 2 to 3 years. Yeah. So how is it different in your mind from the others we've seen from the past? And how is it the same?
Well, thanks. Actually, if I may very quickly just add to something that Nadereh said earlier, when I was thinking in terms of answering that question, I thought Islamic Republic is born February of 1979. March 1979, they create this thing called the IRGC, Islamic Revolution Guards Corps. The name Iran doesn't appear in the title. Sole purpose, to keep power for this Islamic system. So in a way, they've been preparing for these protesters for 47 years, because that's the role of the IRGC. So they've been expecting this kind of protest movement. You can ask the question, why on earth didn't they go ahead and do things differently so they didn't have to crack down? But that's a different discussion. The fact is they've been preparing for this for a very long time. And Ken, funny enough, 99 is also when I'm old enough to be able to actually sit down and make sense of what's going on. That was the first protest that the student movement, and as you said, every
You're trying to make me feel old, aren't you, Alex?
I had to do that. No, but every few years the protesters are out. Answering your question about what's different, well, number one, the frequency. I mean, like you said, it used to be early 1990s, late 1990s, again 2009, and then the last 5-10 years, they're happening every year, every 2 years. Just going back to the protests of 2017-18 to today, dozens killed versus people are talking about 12,000 to 20,000 dead. This is what Hafez al-Assad did in Syria, which everybody's talking about, whatever it was, 1982, right? This is on a scale that Iranians have never seen before. So this is a regime that is burning bridges behind it right now. I have no idea if they have any solutions. I agree with Nadereh. My hope is a civil society, as Nadereh pointed out, dynamic, knows what it wants when it comes to political representation. Again, as Nadereh said, since 1906, they've been fighting this fight for a constitutional system that represents the views of the people. Ali Khamenei comes in, the supreme leader, and openly says, I don't care. The people aren't, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but I mean, listen to his, let me just give you an example. 28th of December, this latest trigger for the protests was the currency, the rial, collapsing. Communities in the Grand Bazaar of Tehran come out, and we know the rest is history. But if you ask Ali Khamenei, why don't you deal with the situation, the currency? Well, you're taking him, if you take that thread and go all the way to find a sort of natural conclusion in terms of what is the root cause, it's his foreign policy, it's his ideology. I mean, the fact that the real collapse didn't just happen in vacuum. And when you then ask him, are you willing to make adjustments? Clearly the answer is no, because this isn't the first crisis he's gone through. He relies on repression, containing it, move on. He doesn't have a solution for in the long term. The only hope we have is if this civil society that exists, that is angry, hungry for change, if they can somehow, and this is where I put my wishful thinking hat on, somehow appeal to the rank and file in the Islamic Republic, I probably would go lower than 20%. I think 20%, if that's the high number, the 20%, a good percentage of it, probably 10% of it, are people who get their paychecks from this regime. They don't buy into the ideology anymore. The folks who still believe in the ideology of the Islamic Republic, I mean, they're a lost cause at this point. I don't think they're that significant. So the question is the rank and file. They look at the people who are getting killed. They're saying one day they're going to be looking for me in terms of revenge. Revenge is around the corner. Do I want to go down with this 86-year-old stubborn man called Ali Khamenei? Because he's sitting on a sinking ship. I don't know how far you can go in terms of the power pyramid to get people to think of defecting. If this protest movement, I don't know what's going on in Iran. It looks like it's died down. I bet you the next round of protests are just around the corner, unless something major changes. And the question is in time between, I mean, I'm sure we get into the issue of opposition later on, but really the question for folks inside the regime who might not have blood on their hands is, this is different. We're not killing on large scale, and we're blaming Mossad and CIA when we're killing 12, 13-year-olds in Kermanshah province. If that's how society's moved, where foreign agents can come in and recruit 12, 13-year-olds, then it's a lost cause. So obviously it's not what it is. That's what the regime narrative wants you to think, that this whole thing is a foreign, manufactured plot. I'm not saying foreign actors don't have an interest. We know they do. But I'm saying if you really want to see the light, you know what's going on in society. Just talk to Iranians, and you could have talked to the Iranians for the last almost 47 years. How the regime comes in with this approach, it's my way or the highway. And again, as I said, if you can convince someone, lower level folks in the regime that, listen, it's time to move. It's time to leave. A lot of folks will hate me for saying this because what are you, a reformist? Are you suggesting gradual reform in the Islamic Republic works? Because history shows that gradual reform is not possible in the Islamic Republic. There's one solution, which is the overtaking of the state and turning it into something very different, which is a very plausible argument to make if you have the tools and the assets to bring and show me that that's how you're going to do it. Otherwise, right now, the most realistic way forward is obviously the people are not going to go away. They're going to come back. The question is, can they be joined by folks inside the regime, again, without blood on their hands, who can come in and start shaking the foundations of the system? Ken, last point. We are already in a transition period. The man is 86 years old. Yeah. When Khomeini came to power as supreme leader in 79, he was there for 10 years. Throughout that 10 years, we were in transition period. When you were that age, in your 70s, 80s, people expect you to leave at some point. So people are already jockeying for power. The question is, which way are they going to go? And this is the moment, both for the Iranian opposition in Iran, diaspora, US, others, to start shaping the minds of folks who might actually be relevant in this transition going forward.
That's great, Alex. I want to ask you one other question because I want you to be on the bridge because you see Admiral Donegan sitting here. You know I didn't invite him here just for his good looks, right? So we're going to get to to some of the kind of the things the U.S. do. But I wanted to pose you the prior question, which is exactly as you're pointing out. There does seem to be this prospect of potential change, of moving some of the folks who've supported the regime into an opposition category. What are they going to be looking for? And again, I'm trying to set up Kid here. What would they be looking for? What might move them? What might cause them to say, you know what, yeah, I can't be on this side of history. I need to be on the right side of history.
To make sure they, meaning folks in the opposition.
Yes, yeah. Well, no, those supporting the regime. Those supporting the regime. Because that's what we're looking for, the change, right?
You got to obviously give them a way out. I think, the president's last set of remarks a few days ago, where he's talking about take down names, hold them accountable, that in itself is worth a lot, I think. But you could also, this is sort of the punishment part. Where's the incentive part? The incentive part, frankly, without, I haven't thought about it, but you've got to give them a way where perhaps they have a future post Ali Khamenei's Islamic Republic. Again, people are going to hate me for saying this. I'm no fan of the Islamic Republic as it is. I've never been a victim essentially of it. But if the choice is a civil war, Iranian anarchy, and Islamic Republic light for a few years, because I think fundamentally what Nadereh is saying is Iran's going to go down the path of secular democracy eventually, because that's what the heart of the nation wants to take the country. So if we're going to sort of bite the bullet and say, well, we're going to have people, like, without having to name names, people who were involved in the bad old regime, but going forward, they might change their colors. Again, I just promised I'm not going to name names, but let me throw one out. Like Hassan Rouhani, okay, former president. The man is as part of this system as anything. His DNA goes back, before 79. Are you going to give him a chance? He's got blood on his hands for sure. But if he can help, if he's the kind of internal player that can help, and again, you've got to hold your nose, but because this is the thing, and we shouldn't forget this, one of the reasons the hundreds of thousands of protesters in Iran didn't end up being millions is this, one of the factors is this reason. It's not just self-preservation, like they're literally shooting people in the face. It's also the scenarios they remember from the region, the many conflicts that, Arab Spring that went wrong. So you got to give people something that looks like an orderly transition. United States can maybe go ahead and start pushing for that. In fact, you could say President Trump's position in terms of whether he's going to choose a candidate or not suggests there is some thinking along those lines going forward. But let me stop there. Can love to hear what Vice Admiral has to say.
So that's great. That's terrific, Alex. All right, Kim.
If I could quickly add,
Yeah,
I
sure,
mean,
go ahead.
the worst thing that we want to do is in a future Iran to start dirtying our hands with their blood. And I think that's very important that, we want to start fresh. We want to start with positive things, and going after these people kind of creates a cycle of revenge and, bloodshed and everything. It's better give them an exit strategy and have them leave rather than having to deal with it ourselves,
Exile rather than execution.
Something, that they're too dirty for us to even dirty our hands, Let's put it this way.
All right, so President has said help is coming. Everyone is all in a tizzy because we've evacuated non-essential personnel from Al Udeid. President has said that he is being briefed on military options. Let's talk about the military options. And I'd like you to take us through them. I'd like to break them up into two different categories because I think this is a good way to think about it. There are things that we could do that would materially help the protesters, that would hurt the ability of the regime to suppress the protesters, right? And I see that as one category of military options, right? And let's start with that. And then later on, I'm going to ask you to come back to, then there's a lot of other stuff that we could do that might not necessarily directly help the protesters or directly hinder the efforts of the regime, but nonetheless could have a profound psychological, political effect, right, that we could use for signaling, that we could use to show support, right? So there's a range of different options out there on the military side, but I see it as important to distinguish between things that would actually help the protest movement as opposed to, that is, physically help them, as opposed to things that would be more political, psychological, symbolic. So take us through that first step. If the president really wanted to help the protesters, hurt the regime, what do we got on the plate?
Yeah, that's a good way of framing it, because the lens that I like to look at military operations through is kind of, it lines up with that very clearly. When it's easy, and you see this, right? Everyone is glomming on, what are they going to do? What actions? Hey, the president has a range of options to choose from. The lens we should really look from is what's the outcome we want when the military piece is over, because the military piece has to be paired with all the rest of the arms of our government and and even the United Nations, which is brought into today, as you can see. So if you look at it through the lens of the outcome, it goes back to what was the military asked to do here, right? Well, we don't know that. Sure, we can all pick these different things they could do, but I think it's good to look at it through the lens of what were they actually asked to do, and one of them is help protesters. Just before I even answer that, what were the other ones that they could have been asked to do? They could have been asked to degrade Iran's ability to attack protesters, number one. And I like that, and it's predominant, but they could have been said, hey, how can we add more pressure to this situation, right, to the regime? It's not a regime change thing, it's just add more pressure. Another one could be regime change, and that's probably pretty far over to one side and requires a different set of forces, right? So if you look at it through that lens, it's a really good one to look at. And then when you're doing that, you also have these other tasks you have to do. You have to protect your own forces, right? You potentially have to be postured to help Israel in their defense, right? Because whether or not they're playing in this or not doesn't matter. They can be associated with us. So put those aside. So I like the idea of let's look at it from what would they do to help protesters. First is you've got to get to what Alex is talking about. You've got to degrade the IRGC's capability to do what they do. This internal security infrastructure that exists in Iran is quite embedded in their society because of the reason of why the IRGC was founded to begin with. So this isn't something where the military is being asked to do something unusual and not go outward. This organization has an entire internal security apparatus that's been very successful since its founding at oppressing the regime. So the IRGC, particularly a certain element, the Basij arm of it, which foundationally is to keep order amongst the population. So that's number one. Think of it, their headquarters facilities, the way they move information and intelligence, the leadership, right? And you would pair any military action, think of the kinetic things, with cyber operations also, right? And not just to turn the power off and things like that, but to get in there and degrade and in some cases disable their ability to communicate amongst themselves, right? And maybe even sow confusion there with some psychological operations at the same time. When the Israelis did their attacks against Iran, they took out leadership, and the leadership didn't know how they were even found out. They weren't sure if it was their phones. They weren't sure if it was their movements. You see, so that slows their ability to do their job and their function, right? So you can do that if you pair your kinetic operations of going after their headquarters and such, and the physical structures, but you also want to get into the way they communicate and disrupt that. And then you want to add to that, enabling the protesters in what they're doing, right? And we've seen that, right? It can be things like Skylink, et cetera. It can be, or whatever. Is that what it's called? Like
Starlink.
Starlink. I said Skylink, I'm sorry. Starlink. But it can also be helping get truth out there on what really happened, because when you shut down the internet, truth doesn't move as quickly. But when you can open it up, you don't want the state-run media to be the ones controlling the message, right? And that gets into, again, the ability of the Iranians to control the message, the ability of them to communicate. There are military ways to get into disrupting those networks, right? And now at the same time, you have to be careful, because you don't want to take down communication methods that the government uses, which the protesters are also using to organize. But this becomes difficult. The most difficult is not, though, that line. So I'll stop there, because the other one is the pressure of the regime, and how do you get to pressuring the regime, and how do you get, can you even predict the outcome? And let me just close by saying the predicted outcome of even doing what I said is difficult to determine, right? At what point do attacks start to bother the people, because innocent people maybe become collateral damage, and it looks like an outside interference. And now you're aligning with the Iranian message that these are those folks that are doing this, like I told you, see what they've done. You see what I mean? So you have a difficult balance.
Yeah, let's dig into this a little bit before we come to the kind of, again, the more symbolic kind of stuff, again, which I don't want to suggest is unimportant just by using that word. If if we were really going to try to help the protesters hinder the government, I mean, most of this is, they're just folks on the street and they're being beat up by folks on the street, some on motorcycles, but it's, in military terms, it's light infantry, right? Lots of light infantry. If we were serious about that, have we got the horses, right? I mean, how many carriers, how many tankers do we need to be helping, protesters in the streets of Tehran, thousands of people being set upon by hundreds or thousands of government forces? To my mind, when the president kind of started talking about that, that was one of the first things that went through my mind is, if you're talking about a close air support campaign, boy, oh boy, that's a lot of sorties over a long distance.
Yeah, and I don't think that, that's one that would be very difficult to do because you don't have the intelligence on the ground to make that go right. The chances of being successful in something like that go way down because you have this mix of a few of the what I'll call the bad guys doing the shooting, and the crowds are outnumbering those people in many cases. So I think more of the way to help the protesters is what I said, which goes at that. And the actions that we take get more at that central infrastructure. Does that make sense?
Yep,
as opposed
absolutely.
to the local activity. And what do I mean by that? Well, part of doing an operation to help the protesters also means we have to defend our own forces. Taking out more of their missile capability, which threatens outside their own area, which is our own forces. It's Europe, it's Israel, it's whatever. That would be important. And it would be seen more, in my opinion, by the population as targeted on the regime that they want not to be in power anymore, right? Because they are distanced from those missile forces. They're not embedded in that can be an example of the ways that the pressure can be done. But the real question is, do we have the right forces in the region too at the time? We know we put forces in the region because of Syria, right? And we did some operations relative to Syria, but you don't see aircraft carriers steaming off the coast right now. But I don't know that we need those forces in that way. We have enough ships in the area that carry missiles. We have enough long-range capability, the cyber, the psyops, the ability to use tankers to get our folks where they need to be. The carriers don't need to be circling if the president wanted to execute this. But maybe it's good to talk for a second about what would, this execution timeline, because are the strikes really called off, or is this all, remember last time we put a deadline out there relative to Bordeaux that, hey, by Saturday, whatever Sunday, if you haven't done this thing, then we're going to attack you, and we attacked before that. My point is we don't know how much, whether they're really called off or they're not called off. But the way this is done is the military is given an order to do planning. And that's when that mission is decided, right? And there may be a couple of those options they have. This mission, which could be protect the protesters, but there can be a higher level, which is pressure of the regime that's added to. Then the military lays out those plans, and they don't give the president one. They give him, that's why they give him, a menu to choose from, and often that they then, one or two of those gets blended together in what the administration and president would want to act. It's never that simple, my point being. And then the military is called standby, within this period of time, be ready to execute. And that then gives the president a lot of leeway into when the execution can happen. And then lastly, I'll say this president doesn't generally dictate, do it on this day. We've seen that before. It'll be more, do it when you have the forces, when you have the things that you need to be successful in what you told me you were going to do. And we saw that in Venezuela with the removal of Maduro when he left that timing to the military. So I think we have to be careful in thinking that, yes, the protests have gone down, but I don't know if we have an answer on if Trump's going to bring military to bear or not. We just know what he said, but we don't know what's happening behind the scenes.
Okay. Before I turn it back to Nadereh and Alex to tell us about what the impact of some of this stuff could be if we actually executed it, let us talk a little bit about some of the, who are going for these other missions that were more about pressuring the regime, putting greater stress on the regime. What might some of those look like? What are the target sets? What would the thinking be behind them?
Well, I think we all know that one of the targets set could be the supreme leader himself, right? And the president has said that before. Hey, we could have gotten the supreme leader before when the mission to do Fordo, but we didn't. Meaning, we can hold you at risk. Does that make sense? And whether you want to do that or not do that, or how you would do it, I do agree that the supreme leader has been on the way out. So now that brings you back to what's the outcome if you take out the supreme leader? Who steps up? And that's a great question that Alex can probably get to, because it may not be what we all want it to be, because the core regime still remains in power, and the current leader is gone. That may not mean change. But that's number one. So I would say you could do that. There are other leadership targets that could be taken out at multiple levels that could pressure the regime, right? Some of them can be the local police leaders that are orchestrating in the particular towns, right? Their headquarters, their whatever. Then you can ratchet up to other leadership of the Supreme Council for National Security and such. And where are those people now? In other words, those are kind of like the number 2, 3s, and 4s, but they're really a body that guides behind the scenes, helps the supreme leader enact. I won't say guide. Together they decide, where the country's going forward. But you can start holding some of them accountable. And what's clear to me is that between us and the Israelis and our intelligence services, we have some good knowledge on that, and that can, on those kind of target sets, those could be pressurized. Another one could be we could do more against, any capability related to nuclear. I put that probably in the less likely, given that it's hard to connect that dot
You obliterated
right
the
now.
nuclear program, kid. I've been told that.
But I also would come back to this as a final piece. I think what I've seen is I think it's much more important that we have some deal, right? In other words, that maybe the threat of these actions can have the deterrent value we want that drives this back to the table. But if it goes back to the table, it's going to be with concessions on the nuclear program. It's going to be on concessions in malign activity in the region. It's going to be concessions on absolutely don't go after the protesters. So that's what's hard pill to swallow for the current regime, because they don't want to relinquish their military power. Their nuclear power. They don't want to relinquish what the IRGC does, because it's how they've kept power all along, and they don't want to stop their malign activities. So you're getting at some core elements of the current regime. So the pressure piece, though, I think the pressure comes when we include in any military action the continued financial pressure. As you know, there's money moving, we were talking earlier, out of the country. Fine, move out of the country to where it can be severed from the person that owned it, right? If it is an example. So there's the finance side, there's the tariffs, there's the rest.
Great. I want to come back to you at some point, Keith, because I do want to talk about this question about potential retaliation against us, how we should be thinking, planning for that.
Sure.
But Nadereh, I want to turn to you now. As I said, I set up you guys to respond to KID, right? So let's take the piece of these kind of, well, let's start actually, we'll start with a broad question of what's your sense of how Iranians would respond to the United States intervening directly in the conflict? And let's start at the popular level. Alex, I'll give you the regime to do. But, again, KID's laid out a variety of different ways the United States could respond. Some would be trying to go after the regime's security forces directly, right? Others would be more symbolic, going after other assets of Iran, right, as a way of trying to put pressure on the regime. Right? All this in the midst of massive public revolts. What's your sense of how Iranians would respond to it? And I promise you, I'm not going to hold you accountable for it, right? For speaking for 90 million people, right?
Well, before getting to that, I just want to say that these protests will have a very, very long-lasting impact on people, because Today, we are told that there are about 2,000 people who have died. Maybe next week the number will be different. I just want to put it a bit in perspective. I was checking. I saw that in all of in the 20 years that the United States was in Afghanistan, 2,000 U.S. military or Americans died, and about 20,000 were wounded. Today in Iran, in 2-3 days, we had 2,000 deaths and probably even rising. So this will have an incredible psychological impact on the society, particularly because we are told or we hear that there were some, machine gun, Basij or IRGC members with machine guns on top of on rooftops, gunning people, and you don't know who was in that group. So it could very well be that family members of people inside the regime were among that. So we don't really know. They will be years and years, or at least of impact about this. But coming back to the question of what would be this impact, I think Iranians are very patriotic. Let us not underestimate that. I had an Italian colleague, and he said, we in Italy, we are very, very patriotic too, but you guys go a few, into the stratosphere in terms of patriotism. I think that if it is very surgical against the IRGC top layers, against certain people will accept it, but sort of like just bombing like this or getting kinetic, I think that's the term, having a kinetic impact. I think it will backfire because in a way people will be saying, oh my God, my country is being attacked, and I cannot voice my opposition to the regime, which is what happened in the 12th-day war. Everybody thought that people would be rushing out. So I think that we need to be very careful about if an attack, a kinetic attack, is considered or contemplated, what very, very specific targets are used. Otherwise, for instance, some of the members of the opposition have talked about cyber attacks on, for instance, the Iranian Seda and Sima, which is the television. And well, if we kind of are able to impact that, not that a lot of people watch it, but when the internet is out, that's the only way of gaining information. And even though they have a very biased view of how they present their information, but you can still get a lot of information from that bias because Iranians know how to read between the lines and how to do this. But so in other words, there are ways of kinetically targeting very, very specific so that people will not be affected, and the Iranian, how should I say, territorial integrity will not be hurt or anything. But at the same time, so in other words, what we don't want to do is suddenly, aligning people behind the IRGC because of the fact that you have an attack. So it has to be very carefully thought of.
Yeah. Can I add something to this? I think it's so you hear a lot about, well, we should just attack the oil infrastructure of Iran so they can't profit anymore, because that's the way to put maximum pressure on this already strained economy. But if you start to do that, now you have now you can line up to having the Iranian population lose hope, because it'd be different. A blockade or something like that would be different than taking the infrastructure and making it go away. Does that make sense? Is that really what you're talking?
I don't think that you would achieve it if the infrastructure would be destroyed.
See what I'm
because people will say, so much of our hard-earned whatever funds. So it has to be if it has to be an attack from outside, which I think could possibly do something, but it has to be very carefully thought of and be very, very targeted. I don't know what you.
That's the reason I wanted to bring that up is because that well, we can just do that, and that'll just and that's easy to say, but probably not the outcome we want, because eventually it has to get rebuilt, and
Right.
you know, and you want to have a vision that here where there's a positive outcome when this is all over, right? And if you have to start rebuilding, then we're in a bad place, if that makes
Let
sense.
me give you an example. For instance, the very targeted bombing of Fordo. I don't think that people really rose up against it so much, because they actually, there was a big backlash against the government, against the regime, because in a way they were saying, look, you wasted all of these resources, you put us at risk, you know, you in fact exposed the country to external attacks just because of your ideology. That kind of, and nobody was, at least not reported to be killed. That kind of very targeted impact, not so much to kind of, you know, for the benefit of, you know, Iran not being able to attack, but to really weaken the regime as such would be useful. People didn't really shed much tears over Fordo in that sense, and it didn't really mobilize people behind the regime, at least not the common people, maybe the IRGC.
Alex, I want to bring you in. As I said, I want to give you the regime side of this, right? How do you think the regime responds? And again, let's take these two different sets of targets. We don't have to get into the details, but if the U.S. were to start a major campaign to really enable the protesters, to really hinder the ability of the regime's security forces to crush them on the one hand, how do you think the regime would respond? And then these more limited strikes, going after different assets as a way of putting pressure on the regime, as I said, more symbolic, more political, more psychological. How do you think the regime responds to these two different approaches that the U.S. might take?
Sure. I just wanted quickly on the issue of U.S. getting involved. One of the things that I'm hearing, because we were talking about previous rounds of protests before, one of the things I'm hearing in sort of what's available to us, given that internet is down, certainly in parts of the political diaspora, is this call for arms. We need arms to defend ourselves. This isn't very common, and this is very dangerous, but I obviously understand where they're coming from. They're saying they're killing us, and you're telling us that we don't need foreign assistance. This is our human rights. This is basic human rights to defend ourselves with any means possible. So I don't know where that argument's going to go, because I'm sure it's going to be, you know, out there in the marketplace of ideas in Washington and elsewhere. A really important one to watch out for. Again, I made the reference to it, this phobia that you have in societies like Iran for when things go wrong, when a political protest is born and it just goes off. In terms of the regime's reaction, Ken, look, I think, you know, there's been reports that Ali Khamenei is looking to get on a flight and fly to Moscow. Never going to happen. He's not going to go up to Moscow and have ice cream with Assad. I mean, that's not the man. If anybody says that, they don't know the system. He'd rather go out like Hassan Nasrallah. That would be a good ending for Khamenei. That's what he wants. Not today, but if it came to that, or a flight to Moscow, he would rather, because that's the martyrdom-seeking Shia political ideology he comes from. And speaking of Shia martyrdom, a part of the regime, I'm putting these numbers out there, they're not scientific, but anecdotal and based on 25 years of covering Iran every day. Tiny percentage might want to take revenge. But did they take revenge when Qasem Soleimani was assassinated? They went back, thought about it, not worth it. Choreographed ways of saving face, but regime has to survive. I mean, the phrase that you know, Ken, maslahat, expediency, what is good for the survival of the Islamic Republic, which takes us back to the sayings of Khomeini. I think maslahat and expediency is relevant here. You can hit them if they still think the cost-benefit analysis means they can survive and not risk total elimination. They would rather survive. They would rather have the Islamic group survive. Even with Khamenei and another sort of, in the last 12-day war, I think you had 31 Iranian senior officers, officials killed. Make it 300 this time around. They still, if they can keep it together, they rather do that and survive. Again,
That's the regime.
That's the regime. That's the
not
regime.
the people.
Not the,
Yeah.
there's one thing that could change, obviously, calculations. If they feel collectively, all the different branches of the regime, the hardliners, the moderates, and everyone in between, if they feel time is up, they will throw everything they have. I always imagined Saddam Hussein leaving Kuwait in 1991, but that was kind of pointless type of thing, and just burning fields, but just making a statement. I think the Iranians probably will do much more in terms of trying to damage, not just the US, because their projection of power is not that great, but whatever they can get their hands on in the region. And if I was in the Gulf states, I'll be worried, because those are the easiest of targets to get to. And it has the added benefit of creating the international energy shock. So if you got your gas plant in the middle of the Persian Gulf and Qatar is getting its income from there, watch out, because the Iranians, probably easy for them to get to that. Again, it might be a last Hail Mary moment. How do I create some kind of a condition where people get onto Trump and say, my God, what have you done? And that's exactly why it's not surprising that we're hearing in the media that the likes of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, others are telling the president, please, you're out there, we're here. If things go bad, it's going to go south, not just for us, but also for you. Because remember, just a few months ago, you signed hundreds of billions of dollars worth of commercial deals. If we don't have money, that's not good for America either. So I think those arguments are actually in many ways kind of valid. But no, I think the regime instinct, even without Khamenei, is to survive. I would be very curious to see if this regime that has kind of shown it can change color at times when it's, I mean, we all remember how when the US went into Iraq, how they kind of panicked, how do we make sure we're not next? Again, purely out of survival, not because they have a grand, wonderful vision for the future. But imagine a situation where people inside the regime actually start, we know after the 12-day war, they created things like the Defense Council. The Defense Council is all about better coordination to deal with external threats. What if you turn it around and make it to a Defense Council about how we do things differently at home? How do you sideline Khamenei? If you think of him as your Hitler and you're that German general, the German generals failed. But what about the Iranians today? Can they sideline him? Because he's stubborn, he's set in his ways, but he's 86 and he's on his way out. And a lot of people are much younger and presumably, we have to hope, are not martyrdom seekers, want to have a day to live after. And again, help them maybe. Because I really fundamentally don't think this notion that some people have. I have all the respect for the diaspora, I'm a member of the diaspora. But this notion that we have a ready-made solution package from the diaspora, we drop it on Tehran and everything's great. No, there are 90 million people in Iran. And some of those people, the rank and file, have a role to play. We've done that pretty much in any war the US has, in Europe, in Japan, in Korea. I mean, so we've got to start thinking along the lines of how do you peel those people off? If killing Khamenei is going to expedite that process for people to defect, that's something worth considering. Am I saying this live or I'm going to record it? But you know what I'm going with this. I mean, one man's life is versus the potential for devastation in a country that so many lives are at stake.
Very good. All right, Kid. So that sets you up very nicely. I mean, and in particular, the points that Alex was making before, if the goal becomes regime change, if that is the mission, I'm not going to say how long I've been watching Iran. Unfortunately, it's longer than Alex, but I have the same view that Alex does, which is this regime will let loose with everything they've got. So you're back in your old job, right? You're in Bahrain. You're the commander of the Fifth Fleet, or if you'd like to be, you could be the CENTCOM commander sitting at Al Udeid, and you've got to think through what is it that they could throw at me, and I got to defend, right? I've got this whole AOR. What do you need? What are you worried about? Do we have it? Can we deal with it?
Yeah, that's as you can imagine, they're not just starting to think about that in this current situation, because we've been here before, right? Where we've had no, we're going to do, if you have some knowledge that you may do a military operation, one of your first concerns is that, you're not then going to have to deal with some issue with losing your own soldiers in this, right? Or airmen or Navy or Marines in this. So we call it posture. We posture our forces. When I was last in Bahrain, we were going to take action against the Syrians, and the Russians were supporting them. It had to do with chemical weapons, if you remember. But we had forces dispersed all across Iraq and all across Syria that potentially are vulnerable to attack. Does that make sense? If we were to attack.
Right, of course.
So one of the things we do as the military is we plan to set our posture so we can best defend ourselves when we're taking offensive operations, if that makes sense. So in this case, each of the commanders there, whether it's the maritime or the air or whatever, wherever we have forces, and we have tens of thousands of forces in the region, it's not just the ones in Bahrain, it's not just the ones in the Emirates or somewhere else where we have these bases, or in Qatar, right? It's also the forces that are battling ISIS in Syria, right? Can the Houthis reach out and touch somebody in the Red Sea or or in the Straits there? So that protect your forces goes well beyond just that, right? It's our embassies and our compounds and places that are symbols of what's behind you, the American flag, right? Because that would be the objective of the enemy, right? To say that you attacked us, but look what I did to you, right? There's a smoking something somewhere that's got a United States flag in the background. That's their objective. So I am certain that Brad Cooper, who's running CENTCOM, has been through this before, because he had the job in Bahrain. But more importantly, his team has, and they're going to be postured in the best way possible. But the other lens you have to look at it through too is that we're not leaving the region, right? Despite everything you kind of hear, right? We're going to be around, but our allies are also there, right? Our Gulf allies, for example. And what's the lens that they're looking at this through? And how much do we want to make sure that they're also not going to be targets, right? But their lens is different, right? As you see, some nations have come out and said you can't use our space or our facilities to do anything against Iran, because they're interested in stability. They don't like the regime, no doubt about it, and they'd like it to fall apart. But at the same time, they don't want to be the ones taking the brunt of what Alex said, which they could be guilt by association. So I'm not saying that your force protection, your force posture and force protection plan is, the
only consideration.
Is the only consideration, but you are setting that posture, right? And when you take military actions, that's predominant in what you're doing. I will say this: when you hear someone say, "Oh, look, they evacuated this base or moved people out of here or did that," when that information comes out, you can be rest assured that didn't just happen at that moment. It wasn't detected. In other words, there's ways of doing this, and then when those things come out, they're often to let people know that we're really serious about what, the option to use the military. Does that make sense? That it can add pressure that helps your deterrence value, right? Because if you make a threat to use force, but they see no changes in your force posture, then they can look empty, right? But in this case, I think it is true that we have postured in the right way, so that the president, if he chooses, can take the action he wants without worrying about having not done something right for protecting his own forces.
Terrific. Okay, we're going to open it up to questions, and I'm going to start by taking one from online, because we've got a fantastic one, one I just love. So I want to start there, and then we'll take questions from the audience here, and I'll flip back and forth.
So you somehow secretly got those handed to you while we were turning over this way?
My staff moves
They're awesome staff.
with stealth that you wouldn't, Zumwalt-class destroyer. It has no stealth like my staff here. All right, so the question I have, and I think it's mostly for Alex Nadereh, but Kid, you're welcome to answer it as well, is very unclear that these protests will, and I'm being kind, overthrow this regime. Right? I think we can all be hopeful, but the likelihood does not seem terribly high. What should we learn from this iteration for the next time? And what should we be doing now to prepare ourselves, whether it's, we are the United States, Iranians, US military, whatever it may be? What do you take away from that for what we should be doing now, what we should learn this time for the next time? Because, as Alex and I were talking, there's going to be a next time. And probably, not that long into the future. Nadereh, do you want to start?
Yes, I think, I was also thinking coming here, it's like, if Mr. Trump were to ask me what to do, what would I suggest to him? Which is a little bit along the same lines. and kind of playing on Mr. Trump's, on President Trump's personality and his view that he doesn't want to do the same mistake that he said Obama and President Biden did of appeasing the regime. I think he needs to be a game changer in that sense. Now, game changer can, of course, happen through kinetic action, but it also could happen in a different way. And he wants to be a peacemaker. So I think that one way he could really, and Iran is what the issue with the currency showed is that Iran is at the end of its economic resilience. But before we thought there were different phases and cycles of how Iran could really exercise resilience against sanctions, against all of these things. It's now at the end of it. And with the collapse of the Bank Nadereh, which was actually very interesting, it's the bank that collapsed, and it has it was the bank of the future. It's very, even poetic that that bank should collapse by itself
Right.
because of corruption and everything else. I think that what Mr. Trump could do is he could maybe enter into some discussions with whoever is in the regime about missiles, how many missiles, how many, I don't know, pounds or kilograms of enrichment, and what kind of enrichment. Or he could say, I want to have a referendum. This is something that is happening, that there are people inside Iran who have voiced that we should have another referendum to see what regime. And this is also a demand from anybody from Prince Reza Pahlavi to the Republicans. What is the political concepts of all of these people? And in this referendum, of course, people who are in the regime, I'm not talking about the IRGC, but others who are in the regime who want to kind of, peel off or so, have a room to play. The young people have a place to voice their. Iran has had one positive experience in the past 47 years, is that we've had regular elections. And the elections are always very much filled with, excitement, and Iranians know how to, they've learned from America how to do, campaigns. I think we could use this as a way, and maybe President Trump will say, you know what, I will deal with you if you are going to do a referendum about the shape of the regime, the shape of the government. If the Islamic Republic wins, fine. If the Islamic Republic doesn't win, that's fine. It kind of really putting in place a transition, because all of these other halfway activities that he may want to do, they're just like stopgap. Maybe they will work for 1 year, but they're not extended. The problems, the fear of our neighbors when they are from Turkey to Pakistan to everywhere else, when they have been kind of lobbying with this administration, with President Trump, about any kind of kinetic approach, I come back to this word again, is because they're afraid of an implosion in Iran. And whatever happens in Iran is not going to stay in Iran. It's going to affect the entire region. So if President Trump could put his full force and weight on a real transition of a pluralistic transition, and demand a referendum, a plebiscite about the future of Iran, that would be, in my view, something that would definitely distinguish him from all the other presidents in the last, maybe even 100 years. And it would definitely put Iran on the right footing for the future.
Interesting. Alex?
I wish I could be that. I mean,
I know,
I'm enthusiastic.
I am putting my
Well, number one, you need a whole different Donald J. Trump, because this is what you're.
But maybe, he can surprise people, But
He's famous for not want to be involved in the business of nation building and so forth. And what you're essentially asking for, unless Khamenei, willingly says, you have a free election or referendum and I'll accept, which he's not going to do, then he only has one way to enforce the mandate, which is to take the United States into another Middle Eastern, essentially, nation-building project. For that
But
reason,
maybe the maslahat or the
I think referendum
expediency
is a
could be-
great idea, but you need folks inside of Iran to appeal to Trump, and not just the opposition in the diaspora. So you need convergence of forces for that sort of thing to happen. But United States certainly could support that kind of a political trend if that becomes viable. I see you got a lot of cards there, Ken. So I will be very quick in terms of the question about what I learned. Look, one of the things that stood out for me was as people literally were being killed in Iran, I was watching diaspora media debates, and they were fighting about whether you should have a republican system and monarchy and who should lead it and so on. 47 years of Islamic Republic, and that's the state of the opposition at the height of a crisis where you should be maximized in terms of unity, clear message, and you do the opposite. Anybody on the fence thinking, what am I going to buy into here if I support these people? Again, I do not underestimate, in fact, I totally get the anger. But what I don't understand is why the opposition in diaspora, which by the way should not be dismissed, they've been eyes and ears of this protest movement. Without them, you wouldn't know what's happening in the dark Iranian nation where the regime wants to keep everybody in the dark. So extremely important role the diaspora has played, and they can be extremely powerful ambassadors for the transition or future Iran. But when you have opposition, look, again, I think Reza Pahlavi, the crown prince, wonderful man. He is, as a human being, wonderful from the few times I've met him. But I was surprised by the fact that, and I'm not just putting the blame here at his door, but the fact that last minute you have to go in and kind of meet with advisors of the President of the United States. Maybe that's not his fault. Maybe the US should have asked for that meeting as well. I'm not just, but the fact is there wasn't anything ready to take advantage of a strategic opportunity potentially. People were trying to figure it out as people were dying in Tehran. So time was of essence, and it was entirely, I think, wasted. But again, going back to the opposition quickly, what is it that at a minimum brings you together? Please agree on that, because that message could be enough for whoever wants to protest next time in Iran. Say, actually, it might be worth it, because I can see there's some clarity of a pathway forward, which wasn't necessarily the case. Again, if you're Reza Pahlavi, there is that pathway. But his challenge is to maximize the movement, bring a lot of other people around him as a leader for the transition. And I know he's trying, but fell short as of today. Needs to be done much better going forward.
Yeah, and I would like to add that he cannot, or at least the monarchists are a big bloc, 40% or so, as some 40, maybe even more. He cannot do it by himself, and we cannot do it without him either. So that's the important thing. He has to be part of the
There is no other figure that comes close to
him,
name
and then
recognition.
lots of little ones. Yeah.
Kit, anything you want to add to that?
I think we want to get to questions. The only thing that I'll tell you is that deterrence does work against Iran, right? It has to be, they'll understood that you're going to use the force, and that's maybe why we have a little bit of a impasse on the killing of terrorists now. And Iran doesn't do well if you don't do anything. That they see that as a weakness. So a threat without,
Well, I mean, it could be that, sorry to
I don't mean
could,
military. I'm just saying
yeah.
don't follow up.
I mean, it could be that because sanctions relief is very important for Iranians to be able to really manage everyday life. So one could perhaps, tie a political or change to some
Absolutely
limit, small sanction relief so that there is a positive incentive for change.
All right, let's take one from here. Go right.
Hey,
Just wait for the
wait for a
mic.
microphone. Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you very much.
And if you could introduce yourself.
Yes, yeah, my name is John Leisenring, and I'm with J&J Real News, and I always have to issue a disclaimer. We try to be unbiased, which is very difficult in today's news world. I want to thank always, as I do at the top, MEI, Alex, and Ken and Alex for helping to stage this great event. I know you've done Saudi Arabia and Syria recently, and I think you're providing just an amazing wealth of information for a very hungry public to get to the truth. The question is, you have an amazing group, by the way, of interns here on my left in the front row who are trying to glean everything they can. And for the benefit of them and for the general public, I think a lot of people have had this traditional view that the brain trust of Iran is the Supreme Leader Khamenei and then the mullahs. And I think it would benefit many people online and here in the audience to have, if you could, a slightly deeper dive on who the opposition at this point, the brain trust of Iran is. I consider them the opposition because the younger demographic of Iranians would obviously like to see change. And Alex, you cut off my question, but that's okay. Reza Pahlavi, the exiled crown prince of Iran, is quite eloquent, and I think you've stated your potential reservations for him, but maybe you can detail how he might come back and rise to power, or a good group of constructive exile leaders might come back to Iran to help forge a better future.
Can I very quickly,
Yeah,
I did another,
please.
if you want to take the other part, on the Unrest Pahlavi question, my reservation goes as far as saying, I wish him, the Crown Prince and his team had done more in unifying to the extent possible, more folks around the cause and being ready to sort of offer themselves as the alternative in waiting. It was always going to be very hard. It was always going to be very hard of a proposition. You know, we see that with President Trump's reaction. You've been out of the country for 47 years. Why would I think you are going to be? And I think President Trump, frankly, I mean, listen to the slogans in favor of the Crown Prince, Reza Pahlavi. I've never in 20-some years heard his name being chanted the way we heard the last few weeks. So for sure, he's getting, you know, some traction we haven't seen before. My reservation again is see, people often think of him as going back and finishing or being his father. But that's not his message. His message overall is, I am the transition manager to something different. And if he can convince more people of that, that's a great role that he could play. As opposed to seeing him as monarch in waiting, see him as someone who, for example, he has been very busy creating, you know, alternatives for the Iranian economy, how you run a government. You're dealing with environmental issues, the long list of crises that Iran has. Reza Pahlavi has gathered some of the top brains in Iranian diaspora to give him ideas. And some of these people are pretty high up in the fields they come from. This is exactly what an Iran that has been in many ways shut off from the world for so long could use. So absolutely, he could do more. But again, I want to go back to a point I made earlier. He is who he is. He's got name recognition. It comes from that political pedigree that he has, and there's nobody out there in terms of a name that can sort of challenge him for that position. If this protest dies down, and it looks like for now it has, but again, we all seem to agree that the next round of protests is just around the corner. He needs to just do much more, but I think that is a better formula going forward than expecting a sort of a committee of experts to sit around and producing wonderful white papers that just doesn't capture the imagination of the youth in Iran, because that psychological part is important. How do you capture their attention and sort of buy into the vision that you have for the future? And I think he's in a very strong position to be the one man who can do a better job than anybody else. But anyway,
Yeah, just one. I mean, even if there is one thing, Reza Pahlavi, and then there is Pahlavism in the sense of the policies of the Pahlavi, the openness toward the world, the economic policies, and so on. And I think people want more and more because they look back and say, well, you know, we had a lot of things were right. So I think that there is also a kind of a longing for having a very respectable, I don't know, passport, having a very strong currency, having, you know, connections with the world and so on. So I think that he represents some of that thinking and some of that longing, I would say.
yeah.
Okay, let's take another one from the audience right here on the aisle. Barbara.
Hi, Barbara Leaf, affiliated both with the MEI and with Arnold & Porter Law Firm. I wanted to ask, one of the things that seems missing here, I mean, Alex, you talked about trying to peel off those who support the regime, but, you know, we all know that the IRGC, 150,000 strong, is sort of like the core piece of the security state, the security apparatus, or the security state, which risks simply eclipsing any transformation of Iran if if you remove Khamenei, you may just get IRGC, as fully in charge. And so the other piece I'm wondering about is there's the missing piece of defined U.S. objectives end state. To Kit's point, how do you fashion good military or other tools, muster them if you don't know what the end state is that the president's driving for? And then there's a question of messaging, disciplined, constant messaging, both to the protesters, which he has spoken to, the president, but he's not, and he's sort of speaking at the regime in a general way. But if we're talking about trying to really affect the thinking of the hard men of the IRGC, how do you get at that? And is there any prospect in all of this of peeling them off or of splintering them? Because this is the piece that I find hardest to puzzle out.
You want me to take? I'll take the IRGC part, and then so Barbara, the numbers is pretty large, 150 to some have higher numbers, and as we discussed, long history. IRGC has been around in this business for a long time. But I also know, as an Iran watcher, that there are divisions in the IRGC. There have always been divisions in the IRGC. In fact, he hasn't even been trusted fully at times by Khamenei himself, who famously in the 1990s had a big purge of senior officers because they started developing their own ideas. A lot of former veterans of the IRGC, certainly the ones who fought in the Iran-Iraq war, are very bitter today, if they're still around, because they feel they fought for something that was supposed to make life easier for them and their families and didn't happen. So they didn't become beneficiaries of the patronage system that Khamenei has run. So this takes me to the issue of the second and third generation members of the IRGC, people in their 50s and younger. Again, they're seeing society as angry as it is. It's not a Mossad made product. This is a reality. This is a society to live in. How do you convince them that time is good to rethink? But you also have to give them a pathway. It could come from outside, but frankly, it has to really be more of an inside change that creates for them to, I don't remember which election it was, but there was a study in one particular where IRGC members were voted clear majority for a reformist candidate. I don't even think it was Mohammed Khatib, it might have been somebody else. So I'm saying they are coming from that society. Just because they're not Artesh, the conscript army, doesn't necessarily mean they're totally ideologically committed to the regime. A lot of folks join the IRGC, have done traditionally for the perks of the job, the loans you get, all the benefits that come with it. Doesn't mean they're going to die for it. I'm not saying not everybody, but I'm thinking the majority of them, presumably at this point, can see the writing on the wall. And if there's a way out, there are divisions in the IRGC. My bottom line is there are divisions. Look for ways to exploit it. Not necessarily the US in the first, but the opposition. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Okay, I want to take one from online. This one's for Kit. We've got forces in the Caribbean. We've got forces facing China. We are sending ammunition to Ukraine. We're firing off every interceptor we've got. Have we got the wherewithal to take on yet another war?
Well, the interesting thing about the United States is, you've heard this quote before, right? The United States is a superpower, can do more than one thing, right? And that is really true. And in other words, we don't have to be everywhere all the time. That's number one. We don't have to solve every problem in the world. And I think, you've heard many different administrations say that same thing. In this case, I don't see us trying to take on a war here. I see us more trying to influence events to a positive outcome with what we can provide, right? And the last time that this administration did something to Iran, you saw a very similar thing, right? It wasn't the United States going in to take on Iran. It was to achieve a particular outcome. I think we saw the same thing in Venezuela. And I've definitely heard this administration say time and time again, they don't want to get entangled in another war. So for the other thing that we have that's very unique is our forces are inherently maneuver forces, right? Gone are the days necessarily we have to have huge armies based in particular places to achieve deterrence and outcome. As you can see, we've lightened our footprint in Europe, we've lightened our footprint in other places, but we have forces that can maneuver and get to where they need to be when we need them. especially if we can control the timing and we're not in a defend against something right now scenario, which is something like this. So I don't see that as a risk because, there's a carrier in the South China Sea, there's one in the Caribbean, we have others in other places. So if you need that particular force, if Brad Cooper decided he needed it, I believe, he could get it in a time to get it. And so I'm not worried about that. Longer term, I'm always worried about the readiness of the force for the longer term, and you've seen all of the things related to that. So I'm not discounting the fact that we have to ensure our force is ready to be able to do these things. But in this, I think it comes down to what Ambassador Leaf was saying, though. What is the outcome that we're trying to achieve here in Iran? The president was clear. It was, we're coming to the protesters' aid, but at the same time, as you know, he doesn't like the regime. He doesn't want nuclear weapons in Iran's hands. So that's, I think, one piece that's a particular red line for what's going on. And he doesn't want to be, he doesn't want to see Iran controlling events like they do now with the Houthis shutting down the Red Sea. So those are things that I believe are less than going to war and more about achieving objectives that are in the best interests of the United States and, to be frank, our allies, right? A stable Middle East of some kind, or at least more stable than it is now. And he doesn't want to do something that's going to disrupt a plan forward for Gaza, right? So there's a lot, there's a lot of interplay going on.
So let's take one more from here. Over there.
Thank you. Cenk Sagnik. I'm the U.S. Director for the Jerusalem Center. I'm proud that I was going to ask the same question Ambassador Leaf asked. So, but the other thing is, if Alex could also answer, do we think in case of a broader conflict or an attempt to remove the regime, the Iranian military capacity could go back to the 12-day war in striking Iran, especially when it came to the ballistic missiles and the drones, given that the economic collapse and the fragile regime? Do we think the previous war has depleted Iran of its arsenal? Thank you.
You said Iran, you meant Israel, attacking Israel, is that right?
Yes.
Yes, so, right. Yeah, I would love to hear what you all have to say about that. I don't have the data, but all I know from the open sources, obviously nothing happened, no dent was put in the Iran's ballistic missile, arsenal over the last 3 weeks because of the internal protest. The question is, how much did they lose during the 12-day war or spent, and how much they were able to rebuild? And that's where I'm not sure exactly. There are lots of reports about how they've been rebuilding their missiles. Production rate has increased. But I mean, again, it ranges around 2,000 or so ballistics. I have no idea, but my point is this.
The number of
the numbers.
Okay.
Yeah.
It depends on the range.
I don't even know. Again, what did Saddam do against Israel? Started firing those Scots, right? Iran has to be feeling this is the end for them to start, unless the Israelis attack first, for them to strike Israel. I'm not sure if they're going to go there, unless, as I said, it's a decision they make that they're on their way out. Bring as much devastation as you can, kind of like Saddam did. Pointless, essentially, but it could be the last. But I'm speculating and thinking of something that is purely hypothetical.
So, I don't want to be a sound negative here, but hundreds and hundreds of missiles, they still retain the capability. They still have varying ranges. When they had the war with Israel, the Israelis focused on taking out the missiles that could, and the systems and infrastructure that, one, could protect Iran, so they had freedom of movement, to do what they wanted to do in Iran, to get at the targets they wanted, and two, was the things that could range Israel. Does that make sense? So these large numbers of missiles and things that they still have, because they have missiles, they have drones, they have ballistic missiles, they have drones, they have cruise missiles that can range still hundreds of miles. In other words, Gulf states, those kind of forces, and they have hundreds of those that were untouched, really. Some of the command and control was gotten out, and some of the leaders of those facilities are no longer with us. However, the capability is still there for them to be able to launch those, certainly in the Gulf region, without question. The bigger question is, would they do it? Because they've always wanted to retain some numbers of those and not have them all go away at one time. And even when they were shooting their longer range attacks against Israel, they didn't expend their entire arsenal because, you know, they knew there would be an end to this at some point. So the answer to your question is many, many missiles, many drones, many cruise missiles, and then, but what's not out there anymore is Hezbollah and their capability, which they had an arsenal of missiles that rivaled many countries, right? So that's no longer there. And their ally Syria is no longer an ally of theirs. So that part of the calculus is significantly different now than it was 2 years ago. When I say they have missiles, I mean ones that are actually in Iran, not in the hands of you know, Hezbollah in Lebanon.
All right, well, we're reached the end of our time. There's obviously lots more to talk about, and if this continues to roll on, we'll doubtless have additional sessions on this. I want you to please join me in thanking our fantastic panel. Educate us on so many different aspects of this crisis with Iran. Thank all of you for joining us. I hope you all found it interesting. Look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thank you.